Welcome to the discussion. My guest today is Bryna Dash, the Vice President of Government and Corporate Business at Blackboard. Bryna, welcome to the discussion.
Thank you, Jason.
Let me set just a little bit of context before we get started. If agencies hadn't already moved training online, the pandemic most definitely forced that change. The Defense Department, for example, is massively overhauling the way it trains troops and civilians by hosting courses in a singular online repository. While the Pentagon conceived this concept as early as 2016, the pandemic created that sense of urgency to make the change. DoD says its Joint Knowledge Online system has been hitting record highs, delivering more than 500,000 hours of training every week. Another example is the Government Education and Training Network, a consortium of multiple agencies, including the FAA, the Air Force Reserve Command, the Air National Guard, the Defense Health Agency, and the Department of Justice. GETN depends on distance learning network across the US and dozens of international sites. GETN distributes its training content via a video-based distance learning program. These are just two examples that show today more than ever, agencies are relying on teaching and learning technology to deliver training to their employees. And that technology is not only mission critical, but the data drives decisions about the current and future workforce needs, skill gaps, and training requirements. Agencies are finding more value in online training and education, and the data that comes from it. There are steps and considerations to build on that urgency the lessons from the pandemic has provided. And that is where my guest comes in. Bryna Dash is the Vice President of Government and Corporate Business at Blackboard, and she's going to tell us how the current and future state of online learning is evolving. So Bryna, let's just start. Training has been evolving. We know it has. What have you seen? What has Blackboard seen both from your government customers and from the private sector?
Absolutely, Jason. And I know you wanted to look in recent history, the changes we've seen. We've been in the government space for over a decade now, but the most recent changes are around the use cases by which the government's employing the technology that they've already been enjoying and using for specific, maybe traditional training scenarios, but now they're expanding out to leverage that technology for different use cases like on-the-job training. So typically we think about training, you have to come in to travel into a facility, take a course, maybe it's a 2-day course, maybe for certain programs and certifications, it could be a 2-week course. But now we can do all kinds of different workflows of training, including on the job. A great example of this is at USDA, one of our clients who is using on the job training when they have to shift inspections of different agriculture products. So whereas an inspector may be very proficient in inspecting avocados, but they need to go inspect peanuts, they can pull down the right training at the time that they need it, go over that, and be able to move out on the mission set. They don't have to come back into the training facility or reach out to anybody else to get the assets that they need. Another use case we see is communities of interest. So our NASA JPL customer used Blackboard not just for their training across their employee base, but also for communities of interest around the Mars 2020 launch. And enabling different professionals from across different disciplines to really communicate and collaborate with one another in a teaching and learning sort of way, regardless of formal classes.
A couple of things I want to back up on. First of all, the USDA example is really helpful because what we're seeing is really just-in-time learning. Okay, I have a new thing I need to understand. Inspecting food may have 80% the same, but that 20% is so key to make sure those peanuts, as in your example, are good to be consumed by people or animals or whomever is eating them. Is that when you talk to agencies, do they want that just-in-time learning, just like we hear in procurement, just-in-time delivery of goods and services?
Sure. Micro-learning is a phenomenon within and outside of government. So being able to provide content in a more informal, more consumable way is extremely important, especially now. So the interest in micro-learning has only, increased because of the pandemic. So Blackboard's already employing that with lots of our customers, and USDA is one example of a way to leverage micro-learning and having bite-sized pieces of content that your learners can grab and use on the job.
When an agency decides okay, we need some micro learning on a topic, does they have to take a course that is, let's say, 3 weeks and cut it down to what's the 3 hours that's the most important thing? And can Blackboard help them with that? Or is it done a different way? Walk me through kind of that process a little bit if you can.
It really depends on the agency, the content they already have, and what their to-be state is that they desire, but we absolutely work with agencies on their content development. It is actually one thing that's very different about government from corporate is in the corporate world, you're using content from third parties that you buy. It's pretty static and standard. They're doing certification annual type training to check the box in a lot of the cases, not all of the cases, certainly. And with the government, you have very specific mission sets with very specific content. And that content is the value of the training program. And so yes, we take seriously the content, how it's developed, how we engage the learners in that content, how the instructors present the content so that in total, the mission is successful.
I had a great conversation the other day with the Coast Guard and their chief learning officer and their chief information officer. And one of the things that they brought up is a move to blended learning. In many ways, what we're seeing with just in time is part of not just their move, but the move across a lot of different agencies. And you mentioned the pandemic and how the pandemic is really, if you will, forcing a different type of learning. Are you seeing more interest in this just in time learning or more interest in micro learning because of the pandemic, or what other changes are you also seeing?
So blended learning's been around a long time. That's really where Blackboard excels. Where we excel with our clients is when they have the use case that they have classroom-based learning, they have online learning, and they're trying to optimize that. So I'm never going to say that every learning needs to happen online, Jason, because there are things that the government does that will not, like at the firing range. We're not going to move that online. But what US courts did is they have Blackboard on tablets in the field at the firing range, and they're recording how their officers are doing. And that data and the value of that data is extremely important, especially as they look at their programs over long periods of time, how they're improving and changes they're making to their programs to improve, the mission that they have to fulfill.
That's a really fascinating example because I think you think, okay, well, if I have to go to a firing range, I'll show up, I'll take my training and I'll go back home. But then you add that online piece and you get real-time feedback, you get real-time input. And then the managers also understand, Joe did well, Mary did well, but Ken didn't do so well. Okay, maybe he needs some different type of training or we need to help him learn better. Did the pandemic also push this blended learning even further because so much more had to be moved online and less can be done in person?
Absolutely. So a great example of that is pipeline safety. PHMSA is also a client. They did, as I was saying, their mission is in pipeline safety. They have to actually go inspect thousands and thousands of miles of pipeline in the country. And that is in the field, right? They can't do that. They haven't been training for that online, but they are now. And what they found is that they can do it online. Not only can they do the blended learning aspects and the initial learning aspects online, but they can create the teams that they use in the field in an online environment and make sure that those teams are working together in the varied roles and parts of the inspection, that they are successful when they do go out in the field for an actual inspection versus the training.
What have you seen as the biggest challenge during the pandemic in terms of how agencies have had to evolve? Is it just getting the right classes in place for the just-in-time piece? Is it the understanding, okay, this used to be done only in person, how do we shift online? What are some of those things you're seeing?
So it really depends on where they're coming from. I mean, agencies, the government's huge, the agency mission set is huge, and different programs are in different places of maturity. Some agencies are still using Excel spreadsheets. They just are, and they just need basic automation so they can get out of the management of the courses and into the content and the mission of the courses. And that's, can be a first step. It could be actually a second step for a lot of agencies. Agencies have been relying on enterprise systems for their training. So they've had to use systems that were bought primarily for other purposes for their education. And they're finding that that's not fully fitting all the requirements that they have. And they need systems that are focused solely on education and pedagogy and the things that we've been talking about, Jason, around improving their programs over time. So it really depends where they are in the evolution of what their next step is. Some of our more mature clients who, are pretty advanced with the technology, have already automated a lot of this, have already been using data to iterate their programs for many, many years. What they're looking at now is, how do I connect that data to my missions data? So for example, if I'm training on how to maintain aircraft, are the aircraft in flight longer? And really connecting those data sets so that they can then say, okay, what changes do I need to make to improve the metrics of the mission, not just the metrics of teaching?
The metrics piece is really interesting too, because I think, how do you measure what's happening? How do we measure the impact of the learning? And I think we're going to get to some of the data conversation a little bit. But before we do, I just want to go back to one thing you said as well, which is, in the corporate world or the private sector, a lot of the training is static. A lot of the training is you buy it from a third party because it's maybe Sarbanes-Oxley or it's something else for cybersecurity. While in government, you have the person who needs to understand how to inspect peanuts, or the person who has to understand how to inspect a pipeline. Is that the biggest difference you're seeing between government and private sector, or are there other ones?
One of the biggest difference actually isn't about the learning or the pedagogy. It's technical in nature, Jason. A big difference is security. So in the corporate space, we don't always need to employ the same security protocols as in government. And that is serious. The things that we're training on are serious. And we take that seriously. We invest millions of dollars in the security of our products so that the government can use them for nearly anything. So we are able to put Blackboard on a secure network, a closed network, out on the .com network for full accessibility and availability of public training that the government offers. And we can cover all those paradigms. But I think being able to do that is extremely different than in the private sector. Of course, there are other differences too around the use cases that I'd mentioned, because the use cases are varied. I mean, the government is not just training its employees. They are training stakeholders, they're training other countries, they're training across government agencies. So you'll have an agency that has a mission to train other agencies, right? And how do they do that? These are not insignificant things for the government to accomplish and overcome, and they've been doing it extremely well. I do think it's much more complicated in the government.
You almost said it. I thought you were going to go down that path and we're going to have a good FedRAMP conversation, but we won't, because we don't want to bore the audience too much. But you're right. I mean, there's no FedRAMP in the private sector. They'll ask you, here's your SLAs, here's the security we need. You guys will say yes or no, and you'll go from there. But with government, you have a minimum set of security requirements, and then you have to build from that. And as you said, it can be on a closed network, a secure network, or on more of a public network. Brenda, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we can continue our conversation and maybe jump into that data discussion. You're listening to The Discussion, Learning and Your Agency's Mission, sponsored by Blackboard on Federal News Network.